This horrible abomination that you see on screen before you is not a bootleg ripoff of a classic game as featured on some obscure plug-and-play machine with substandard games and build quality, but something that was actually licensed by Nintendo for play on your Super Nintendo Entertainment System. This is Frogger for Super Nintendo, released in 1998 by Majesco Sales and conceived by Morningstar Multimedia. This just so happens to be the third version of Frogger I've done a review on, the first version being the excellent Sega Genesis version, which featured a near arcade-perfect port that could easily pass for the real deal. And just recently, there was the Game Boy Color version, which looked terrible but was still a widely playable iteration, if you want some Frogger on the go. Now these versions were also conceived by Majesco, and internally what they have in common is that they featured this depressed cartoon frog on the title and intermission screens. The Genesis version is the only smart one. As it being a straight arcade port, it limits the frog to the title screen and game over screens. Genesis did what Nintendo didn't, indeed. It kept it simple. Stupid. So rather than go for a straight arcade port like the Genesis version did, Frogger on the Super Nintendo is given something of a facelift. Pre-rendered graphics, cartoony sound effects, seizure-inducing river. Goddamn, this is terrible. As alluded, this looks less like a visually updated version of Frogger and more like a shitty looking knockoff that you play on one of those cheapo Wii knockoffs that were all the rage 6 to 8 years ago. In fairness, it doesn't look completely terrible, but it's also not all that visually appealing, especially if this screen is the only screen you'll be playing. Yes, they had the good sense to overhaul the visuals and sounds of a classic arcade game, but they retained the old school gameplay with no significant updates or enhancements. It's just classic Frogger as you remember playing it ages ago, except it looks like shit. And you know what? That's perfectly fine. Especially when it comes to replicating the classic arcade gameplay, Frogger does a rather admirable job. It's essentially the same game you played ages ago if you played the old Frogger arcade game. You navigate your frogs across the street of running traffic, hopping onto logs on your way to home caves, and you repeat 4 more times until all the caves are filled, at which point you move on to the next level where they'd add a new hazard like gators and snakes and something. It's your traditional game of Frogger. Plays about as well as you'd expect, controls fairly well, it sticks to the classic formula fairly well, and it doesn't do much to deviate from that formula. No alternate modes of play or extra crap tossed in there. You could do either 1-player or 2-player alternating, and that's it, and it works fine. In terms of playing Frogger, this is as good a version to play. I only wish it looked and sounded as good as it played. I've already touched on the putrid graphics, so I'm going to lay off that. Sounds mediocre. Again, with the visual facelift comes new sound effects replacing the quaint but pleasant sounds of the arcade original. Gone are the familiar musical jingles and beeps and bleeps of the original arcade game, and in its place are obnoxious cartoony sound effects to go along with the depressing cartoon frog and ugly visuals. I'd imagine this would have looked and sounded better on PlayStation, which did get its own remake of Frogger. Maybe they just should have followed the Genesis route instead. A straight up arcade port, maybe a couple extra modes to sweeten the deal. You know, kinda like what Williams/Tengen did with Miss Pac-Man. But this just looks and sounds awful. No. Just no. Frogger is the final game to grace the Super Nintendo, and what a sorry state to go out on. Yes, it plays about as well as any other iteration of Frogger. It's a very functional version of Frogger, but it just doesn't look or sound the part. Bottom line, if you can look past the shiny pixels and annoying sound effects, you might have a fun time with Frogger if you're into classic arcade games. But if shiny pixels and annoying sound effects aren't what you'd call a fun time with Frogger, then there's the Sega Genesis version, which is near arcade perfect and excellent. I'd say go with that instead. Or frankly, any other version of Frogger for that matter. This Frogger is more an acquired taste than anything, and even that might be a stretch.